Thanks for the reminder, whoever sent that on the recording.
All right, wonderful. Well, welcome everybody to the September All Aboard Ohio statewide meeting. We've got some wonderful guests today that are going to be presenting for us. There he is. All right, wonderful. Well, we'll get started here. Today's topic is going to be maybe a little different than we have advocated for in the past, but after our annual meeting in July, we are really focused on not only just advocacy for passenger rail, but also for advocacy for other modes of transit, all the way from, passenger rail down to pedestrian. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about modes without motors. So again, pedestrian and bicycle transit options. And we've got two very special guests to present to us. The first is our good friend, Cincinnati City Council member Mark Jeffries. For those that don't know, Mark has been an absolutely outspoken advocate for all things transit in the greater Cincinnati area. He was very kind to join us on a panel at the Midwest Sustainability Conference earlier in the year in May. And talked a lot about Cincinnati's plans for expanded public transit that would then go hand in hand with particularly the 3CD, but ultimately any passenger rail that would pass through that greater Cincinnati area. And the folks down there in the southwest corner of the state recently had a wonderful success, and that is what he is going to talk about today. So, council member, I will turn things over to you. I will be in control of the slides, so you let me know when you're ready for the next one. But with no further ado, let's talk about Cincinnati's red bikes.
Excellent. Can you hear me all right, John?
I can.
Perfect. Good. Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone, for joining. As John mentioned, Cincinnati City Council Mark Jeffries. I am on my second term. We're on 2-year terms here in Cincinnati, and I have always had a passion for public transit. Originally from New York, I went to school in Chicago City. Went to school in Chicago, DC. My dad is Dutch, so I lived in Europe, and I've lived in Asia, and then I landed in Cincinnati 24 years ago. And so this has always been I've seen amazing public transit. I've seen amazing bike infrastructure where I've lived and traveled. And so always had a passion for this. And this issue in particular, as we get into it on red bike, has been, as many people know around the country, there have been challenges with bike share, just kind of the business model. And so some of that also serves. I've spent 17 years at P&G and I own my own business. So solving business problems, this is kind of very similar. So it's a story, work in progress, I would say. The end is not fully written, but we're on a really interesting trajectory. So John, if you go to the next slide, I just have a couple of slides here to walk through kind of the background and get you grounded on some of the issues, and then we'll open up to questions. So Red Bike is a 501c3. It's a nonprofit station-based bike share system. So some systems are owned and operated by governments, local governments like Philadelphia. Some are for-profit, but in our case, it is a nonprofit. That's important to note. And I'm not going to read the mission statement here, but it is around transportation, low cost, green transportation options, and connecting people. And this is how it was not designed, to be clear, though, to be integrated with other public transit. It's something that we'll get into, but it was designed just as a mode of transportation for all folks. So go to the next slide. So by way of background, it opened 10 years ago with service in the urban core of Cincinnati. It then expanded to include Northern Kentucky, in Newport and Covington and Bellevue. So currently about 70 stations throughout multiple neighborhoods. There are about 400 bikes, over 144,000 rides. Interesting thing about the Cincinnati system, and it does relate to transit, is that we have a program that's called the GO program. So you see all the rates there for kind of everyone. The GO program are people who live on some kind of public assistance, so they can buy for $5 a month a pass, and these are unlimited. So folks use it, quite a bit. And that equity program has really been a model nationally. A lot of other systems have looked at it, and about a third of the riders are in the GO program. We do know that several folks use it. Sure, people use it as recreation and for fun, just like they do bus systems or even trains. People enjoy riding rail for fun or for recreation to go to sporting events or other things. But people do use it as a mode of transportation to buy groceries and then also get to work as well. And they are in the process of transitioning to an all-electric fleet. So that's by way of background. Go to the next slide. So for years, for the first 9 years or so, Red Bike was funded primarily as via private funding from UC Health. So UC Health is separate from the University of Cincinnati. It is a healthcare provider. They decided not to renew their contract in 2022, not for reasons that they were dissatisfied with it, but frankly, UC Health, as all very public information, has been losing money, especially during the pandemic. They lost a significant amount of money, as a lot of health systems have, and financially they just pulled back from any public sponsorship. So it wasn't an issue with it's not working or anything, just it didn't work. Subsequently, in March of this year, Red Bike's board of directors decided to permanently terminate the service. So didn't inform anyone. They said, hey, we're going to terminate it. Again, it is a 501c3 nonprofit, so they are in control, if you will, of that decision. And they said, hey, we're going to begin the process of dissolving and selling all assets. So to be clear, as I alluded in the setup, there are a lot of systems that have had some challenges. So Minneapolis shut down, Houston. There are a lot of other cities where the funding model is really not clear. But bike share is subsidized, and we recognize that, hey, we need a model that works and that reflects that. So go to the next slide. So the board of directors said, hey, we're going to shut this down. Me being I'm not only on city council, but I serve on our metropolitan planning organization, NPO, which is called OKI, which helps to fund a lot of Red Bike's work as well. And I heard this and I basically said, no way, like we can't let this thing shut down. And so pulled together what we kind of affectionately call the coalition of the willing to say, hey, what can we do to keep this open? And then separately define what is the sustainable long-term model. So within 10 days, we had pulled together funding, $500,000, what we call bridge funding, from several organizations from the city of Cincinnati, from Metro, our bus system, from the business community, several foundations, 3 foundations also contributed, and then a couple of enthusiastic, riders jumped in. And basically people said, hey, look, this system has a public good. This is very important. Each one of those stakeholders had frankly different lenses, right? The business community sees it as a talent retention and growth strategy, right? Cities that have bike share are, young people want to be attracted to and come to cities where, they're accessible, where there's mass transit, where, there's, bike infrastructure. So from the business community, they saw that as important. The philanthropic community saw especially the GO program as significant. 36% of the folks who are using this are on public assistance in some way, so they need it in order to get around. And then to the government, city of Cincinnati, same thing, said, hey, there is a public good here. And Metro, in terms of transit, it said, hey, there may be an interest here in trying to figure out how this could work within our larger transit system. And I'll share more on that here in the next few slides. Go to the next slide. So as part of this kind of coalition of the willing, one of the local health nonprofits, Interact for Health, was very gracious that they funded a consultant to say, hey, look, the first place that we want to start, we have this bridge funding that's going to carry through next April. We need to look across other similar bike share systems to benchmark our performance versus other systems. So they identified 9 throughout the country that were similar, nonprofits, also not a for-profit model, to help figure out what is the funding. And this is an important point, actually. We've made a clear choice that we want this to be a public good. In other words, the GO program in particular has a public good. We could have made a different choice and said, hey, this is going to be a nonprofit, and we're going to keep it for tourists downtown, but that is not the choice that we made. So we had this consultant come in, and over the last several months, they have done significant legwork benchmarking our performance. The long and short of that is we are on par or better in terms of our operational efficiency of most of these systems, which for a lot of the stakeholders who ran this, that was the first thing they wanted to know, right? Is the system well run? And the short answer is, it is well run. The second is, the work to be done is really creating a vision and a plan for how does this integrate with our broader public transit, especially bus network. Last mile connections. So for those of you who aren't familiar, several years ago, we passed a sales tax levy in the county, Hamilton County, to invest in our metro system. And a big part of that was expanding bus rapid transit. So there are 4 routes, 2 immediately being planned, and then also doing more 24-hour service and expanding basically the metro service. And there is a role for bike share as a part of that, right? So if you think about, a bus might go to a transit center, and you might have a major, red bike station there, and then nodes throughout the neighborhood to kind of get people to the last mile, the last half mile, kind of get them home. So there's work underway on, okay, what does that look like? And then importantly, how do we test that out in 1 or 2 neighborhoods to see what we learned and provide a real integrated solution for people who are commuting to work or even recreation, going down to a Reds game or something, or even going to the grocery store. The third piece is really building out a network of bike infrastructure and safe routes. We have what is termed here in Cincinnati, the Crown Network. It's similar to like the Beltway and Beltline, I think it's called, in Atlanta, which would circle the entire city. So within that, obviously, we want to provide safe infrastructure for people to transit and move. And finally, I think there is a bigger thing here of bike share has obviously struggled throughout the country in many cities. We believe that the ultimate model is having some public investment. In our case, it's probably a little from the city, a little from, and then also from Metro, some from the philanthropic community, because again, about 1/3 of the users of the GO program, but then some private as well. Today, about 1/3 of the fare is recovered from pricing. So 2/3 needs to be covered in some other way, which is not dissimilar to most transit, right? Most transit is subsidized. In our bus system, I think the local Metro said that about 21% of their fair share revenue is recovered, and so the rest is subsidized. So that's not unusual. So what I would say is a sustainable plan kind of is in sight. We have the right stakeholders. It's really making sure that we have energized the right people, and they believe that this is something that is a public good. So yes, and yes, I see the comment here. To be clear, I've also made that point 1,000,000 times in Cincinnati. We spend on the roads are subsidized too. In Cincinnati, the point I make, because we are at the end here, is we spend $15 million a year on repaving our roads. Not a dime of that comes from gas tax, and so it is subsidized. And we spend another $15 million on parking to subsidize parking venues that we built, parking lots and structures. And so, to be clear, roads are also subsidized. So that's the Cincinnati Red Bike story, mostly complete, but still a lot of work to be done. And then, finally, when you can go to the next slide. ideally when we integrate this network also within Metro, we are, to John's point, trying to get the 3C&D, get Amtrak service down into Cincinnati. That'll be another leg to figure out, okay, we want to make sure that once, the increased Amtrak service comes into our Union Terminal, that we have ways for people to get, which would probably be mostly bus or streetcar, into downtown or into the universities. But red bike is certainly, another option for folks who may not be carrying luggage and may have a short distance to go. So happy to take questions and any comments. So thank you again, John.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Council Member, for joining us on a Saturday morning. If anybody does have any questions, we do have time for a handful of them. So if you wanted to raise your hand or unmute yourself.
Yes, this is Mary Krupa from Youngstown. I have been having problems raising my hand on the Zoom system, but I just wanted to know, how does, with Cincinnati being hilly and a northern city with ice and snow, and how does the bike system work in the winter time?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is usage definitely is higher, call it from March, April, through October. Usage does go down. I mean, you look at cities like Minneapolis and, northern cities, there are a lot of people who still use bikes. And people do still, I personally bike, as I mentioned, my father is Dutch. I think Dutch people are born with bicycles. So I bike to work pretty much every day, even in the winter. So sure, there are days when, snow is bad. And usage definitely goes down in the winter, but overall, it's still an option for folks for most of the year.
And what about the hills and stuff?
Yeah, the hills, I mean, that's where Red Bike rightfully has been gone to, I think they're 75% electric now. Their plan is to move to 100% electric. And that's really a game changer because, to your point, Cincinnati is a really hilly city. And most of the capital comes through federal grants, that we apply for, that the system applies for. And so they are transitioning to all electric, which ultimately, is a huge help for, personally I have an electric bike, same thing. I can wear my suit to City Hall easily without, breaking a sweat. And so I think the electric is a real game changer.
Yeah, Mary, I got to tell you, if you've never ridden an electric bike, rent one sometime, give it a little spin. It's an absolute blast.
Okay.
Jason, oh yeah, thanks, Mary.
Sure.
Jason, did you have a question there? There you go. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, thanks. I saw from the website that the city buses in Cincinnati accommodate bicycles on racks, and I'm just wondering, some of these bike share systems, the bikes are sturdier, they're heavier, possibly different dimensions. Do they also work on the rack system?
Yeah, it's a great question. The short answer is yes, they do. I think most people don't use them on the rack system because, you can just redock it. The reason being, Cincinnati is different. Like, for example, I was just up in Chicago. I used their bike share, and there it's like by the hour. You get charged by the hour. If you get a day pass, you can redock it. So it's easy if you're downtown, redock it, go up to uptown, get another red bike. It's not an incremental charge. So most people don't put it on the buses, but that is an option. It's a great point.
Thanks.
Glenn, go ahead with your question.
Hey, yeah, interesting presentation, sir. I was just wondering, these other cities that are dropping their red bikes, is it because of funding and usage?
It's a great question. It's primarily funding. So the challenge has been similar to Cincinnati. A lot of these systems have had one major funder. So in our case, a healthcare provider. And what we learned is, it's just like anything, like, in business, if you have one major customer and that customer goes away, then your business can collapse, right? So that's why the model that we're moving to is kind of a third from fare recovery, a third from foundations, and then the balance from public and private. So there's not reliance on one. And I think that's the biggest learning.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again, council member, for being here. Great questions, great conversation. You know, I'm very thankful, as I'm sure the folks in the greater Cincinnati area are, that you folks were able to really put together a plan to keep Red Bike active. So thank you for that and all that you do. Appreciate you. And now we're going to move on to our second guest speaker. This gentleman is one that we've been working together kind of quietly behind the scenes for about a month now. The Greater Columbus chapter of All Aboard Ohio has really started dialing in advocacy for what is going to be a transformative ballot measure, very similar to what we've seen in Cuyahoga County and then down in Hamilton County, where we very intentionally are diverting funds from sales tax initiatives towards public transit. And here in Central Ohio, the initiative is called LinkUS. It will be up to 5 or more BRT lanes, better service on the existing CODA network, over 500 miles of sidewalks, bike lanes, transit supportive infrastructure. So this is a very long-winded way of me introducing our next speaker, because he represents one of the organizations that we've been working very closely with here to help LinkUS get over the hump, because it certainly helps everybody in the transit space when we've got more robust public transit. So Brian Estabrook from Yay Bikes, which is a bicycle advocacy group here in the Central Ohio area. He has been, again, a very outspoken advocate of bicycle transit, bicycle safety, making sure that we've got a more complete streets model as we look forward in developing our infrastructure. And I did have a very fortuitous opportunity to meet Brian yesterday at another event. I walked up to him and was like, I've never met you before, but you look an awful lot like a picture of a person that I've seen online. And we had a wonderful chat. So Brian, much like I did with the council member, I've got control of your slides. Just let me know when to go, and I will turn the floor to you, my friend.
Okay, thank you so much, John. Just want to make sure you can hear me all right. Can everyone hear me?
Yep, we're good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, you can pop into the first slide there. As John said, my name is Brian Estabrook, and I am the board president for Yay Bikes. I want to tell you a little bit about Yay Bikes, and then I'll kind of get into the core of my presentation. I really appreciate being invited here. As John said, you know, I have a ton of respect for the work that All Aboard Ohio is doing, and I think, you know, organizations that are working on pedestrian safety, bike safety, multimodal transportation, bus transit, as well as rail transit, we're all working in the same space, and we need to be pulling together and coordinating together when and where possible. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit today. I consider that work broadly to be something called mobility justice. And I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that in a second. So broadly, the mission of Yay Bikes is really to just influence the conditions that help people safely and comfortably ride bikes for transportation. Yay Bikes has been around for, you know, 10 to 15 years here working in Central Ohio, sort of a leader in local bike advocacy, education events around Central Ohio. And you know, recently though, we've shifted a little bit. We still are focused on bikes. We still are focused on all of those things, but we're now thinking a little bit more about our work in terms of, like I said, mobility justice. And I'll say more about that in a second. And thinking about how to create greater safety, comfort, accessibility, and equity really for all users of the public right of way. You know, and that means that everyone's safety, whether you're driving a vehicle, whether you are operating a bicycle, whether using some kind of mobility device, walking, etc. Everyone needs to have safe, comfortable, equitable access to the public right of way. So mobility justice is a framework that we use, and it's rooted in social justice concepts, which probably shouldn't be surprising. And its aim is really to create a world where people feel safe existing on the streets and can experience the streets and use them in all the ways they want to use them, regardless of their mode of transportation and regardless of other identity factors like racial and ethnic identity, religion, background, physical ability, etc. And so mobility justice not only addresses things like the transportation systems, the infrastructure, the policies, the programs, but it also looks at how the existing status quo creates inequities and leaves some folks with less power as they move through our public spaces. And so that means that we need to address things like racism and gender-based violence and implicit bias in the broader system in order to make sure that everyone has access. So I just want to kind of name that up front as something that we're thinking about through this work. And John, you can move to the next slide. So Yay Bikes has been hosting these advocacy summits for the last couple of years, and folks from all aboard Ohio have been in attendance at these, which has been great to have. And so this is some of the work that we've been doing locally to bring different organizations together. We've hosted 2 of these so far. The broader purpose is really to form a coalition and start to get a little bit more formalized about how we work together to advance mobility justice across all these different areas, right? Pedestrian safety, bike safety, bus transit, rail transit, etc. And think about how we can coordinate in terms of bringing all of our resources and contacts and ideas together to act effectively. And so Yay Bikes has been the facilitator of these advocacy summits. We have paid for professional facilitation. We've produced post-summit public documents, which I'd be happy to send to John, and John can distribute if folks are interested in seeing those. But we have been trying to come to some, I guess you could say consensus, some agreements about how we want to work together and how we want to operate in these spaces. And so there are some planning processes locally here, which some of you may have heard of. There's currently the city of Columbus is working on a bike plan, which is called Bike Plus, that's hopefully going to be released later this year. That we've been doing a lot of advocacy on and working closely with our partners at the city of Columbus. LinkUS is a project that is in Franklin County, which is where Columbus is located, that is really going to be essentially creating a formal traditional bus rapid transit network through Columbus that includes dedicated public right-of-way for buses. And so, some of the traditional things that you see with bus rapid transit in other cities, Columbus doesn't have anything like that right now. So that's a big deal. It's actually a ballot issue right now, this November. So we're trying to make sure that gets passed. Columbus also is updating their zoning code. The Columbus zoning code is, hasn't had a major update in about 70 years. And so obviously, if you imagine a zoning code that would have been developed in the 1950s, it's going to be very focused on suburbanized forms of development, car-centric forms of development. So that's really not friendly for the kinds of development that we want. And so there are efforts there. And then obviously the Amtrak expansion, which you all are very familiar with, we want to make sure that obviously people have multiple modes of transportation. So we want our bike network and hopefully our future intercity rail network to work very nicely together. And hopefully, fingers crossed, that's in place before I die. So we're hoping in that direction. So you can move to the next slide, John. So I want to talk a little bit today, and this is one of the reasons why John asked me to join. I want to talk about what a theory of change is and why we need one. And I appreciate the council member's presentation a lot. And I think that some of the things that he talked about in his presentation are going to connect a lot with what I talk about here. Something like the bike share in Cincinnati. How do we save something like the bike share in Cincinnati? Well, we need a theory of change. We need to understand how change is made in a local context. And that means understanding the players, how power moves through the system, how economic interests are utilized, and where decision-making points are, and where veto points are as well in the system. And some of that is public, and some of that happens behind closed doors. And so when we think about a theory of change, a theory of change is really just an understanding of how and why change happens in a particular localized context. And so, you know, the way that change happens in Columbus, Ohio, where I live, is going to be a little bit different than in Cincinnati for a number of reasons. There are different players, there are different interests. Government is structured a little bit differently, et cetera. And so the way that change works in one context is not necessarily going to be how it happens in another context. It's really critical to identify not only the strategies, partners, and resources, but also think about constraints and opportunities. And so there are various constraints that are going to create different opportunities for change and reduce the opportunities of other kinds of change. I like to think of the metaphor of a choir and orchestra, right? So if you go to, you know, the symphony, or if you go to a show, you know, you're going to have, right, 30 to 40 different instruments playing. You're going to have the tenors, the sopranos, the altos, and everybody's doing something slightly different, and everybody's filling a different niche. But man, when it all is coordinated together, and when everyone's singing off of the same coordinated song sheets, it sounds beautiful. And so theory of change is bringing all of those players together to create beautiful music. Next slide, please. One theory of change that I use in my professional work, and I did mention this at the top, but in my professional life, I work as a city planner. And so I'm not here in that capacity, but that is how I get paid. So this is a theory of change that I use in my work. And it's called Warriors, Builders, Weavers. And I want to share more about it here. And hopefully this is useful for all of you and our shared work together. So this is a theory of change that Yay Bikes has adopted as well and used at our advocacy summits. And we use this as a way to think about our work locally. Warriors, Builders, Weavers is essentially 3 distinct roles that individuals or groups or organizations can play. And when these 3 roles are working in that coordinated, harmonized fashion, they can create change. They can advance change together. These are not mutually exclusive roles. I want to say that, you know, all of us have sort of all of these roles within us, but one is likely more dominant in our organization or in our personal disposition. So broadly, I'll kind of talk through this a little bit. And if people are interested in these slides, you know, John has them. You can send them out to folks. I'm happy for anyone to take these and use it. So warriors are really focused on resistance and on protest, and on organizing and mobilizing in a way that contests the status quo. So when you think about the status quo system, it's like, this is what exists currently, right? We live in a car-centric society. We don't have public transit options that are great compared to other similarly situated cities and states. We don't have intercity rail. That is a status quo that is being contested by a lot of different folks, right? And the warriors are the ones who are, you know, sort of, to use a bit of hyperbole, you know, holding pitchforks and torches and yelling at the city gates, right? That's the role that warriors play. And they're demanding transformational change, right? They don't want iterative reforms. They want to tear the system down and build a new system that is fair and equitable and just. So that's warriors. Builders, and I should say as well, all 3 of these roles are necessary. So I'm not putting one above the other. They're all important and necessary. Builders are focused on really reforming the system. They are generally inside of the system. So I work as a city planner, which means that my role professionally is as a builder. I am inside of the system. I am thinking about how to reform, improve, and iterate on the existing system. And I have to take the existing constraints and the existing status quo as a given. In my job as a city planner, I can't be like, hey, we should just toss out the zoning code. I have to work with the zoning code as it exists, right? And hopefully make small improvements and hopefully push for little reforms around the edges. So builders are within the system and they understand how it works, and they have to take its existing constraints as a given. And then finally, weavers are really focused on connection and on the 10,000-foot view in terms of analysis and creating linkages and opening up space for new players and resources and ideas to emerge. So they are the ones that are really focused on how do we build an effective coalition, and how do we bring these different players like warriors and weavers together to create new connections, to let new ideas emerge, et cetera. So organizations like All Aboard Ohio, like Transit Columbus, which we work closely with here, like Yay Bikes, typically play kind of a more dominant weaver role, right? We're bringing together the players, right? You have folks on this call, you have a city council member on this call, right? That's you can't get more inside the system than that, right? But you also have folks on the call who probably want to hold some pitchforks and torches outside of the gates. And you need all of those players. And an organization like Transit Columbus and All Over Ohio can provide that venue where those players sit next to each other. Next slide, please. So all of these players also have constraints and challenges when they're working alone. So again, the beauty here is that when they all work together, something emerges that creates change, that can create change if there's an opportunity for change. But when they're working alone, they face difficulties and constraints. So let me talk about that a little bit. Warriors face difficulties sustaining mass mobilization and protest. Anyone who's ever seen a large-scale protest, they rarely create the kinds of systemic change, right? Sustainable change that the people protesting want to see. And part of that is because it's really, really difficult to sustain mass mobilization and to coordinate across these informal networks that are the folks who come on the streets and protest a lot of times. It's just very difficult to keep that energy up and to make something happen out of it. And a lot of times because those folks are outside of the system and they lack the power and the know-how to make change within the system. So warriors are in need of the practical know-how of builders, and they're in need of the connections and the large-scale sort of analysis that weavers can provide as well. And then builders work inside the system. So because of that, they can be easily co-opted. They can be captured. They can be inoculated, if you will, from the desire for transformational change. They can be, if they've been radicalized, they can be de-radicalized by the system itself. And so builders need the energy of the warriors. They need to see the transformational vision of what can happen beyond the status quo that warriors bring. And they also need the 10,000-foot analysis and the context and the connections that weavers bring. Because if you work in a position where you're a builder, you can get very lost in like the technocratic details of different policies, as opposed to thinking at a higher level of, hey, is this helping people or is it hurting people? And if it's hurting people, what do we do? That's rarely a question that comes up in a technocratic builder space, in my experience at least. So, and then finally, weavers, weavers are great in that sort of ivory tower, right? They want to sit in that 10,000-foot, at that 10,000-foot view. They want to come up with the perfect system in their head and have the debate about philosophy and ideas and all of that. But they need action, right? They need people who understand how the system works internally, builders, and they need the energy that warriors bring onto the streets. And so all of these things come together and create something beautiful, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. You can move ahead, John. But if they stay as individuals, then likely it's not going to be effective. So when they all come together, I do think, to extend my previous metaphor, they do make beautiful music together when these roles operate in harmony. So warriors, what they do is they create space for new possibilities. So when there is a push, when there is a resistance, when there is a mobilization, when there is a protest, from outside the system, that creates space to create potential change. And I won't put our council member on the spot, but I'm imagining if 100,000 folks in Cincinnati came out onto the streets and protested something specific, folks on city council might start listening to that, right? And there's something about the mobilization that creates space and opportunity to create change. But warriors aren't the ones who can implement that change. So builders then are able to use that space that was created by the warriors to push larger reforms beyond just incrementalism. They're able to use their know-how and expertise to convert that idealism that warriors have into a better system and into a better future. So, and then weavers are able to create connections and translate between warriors and builders. If you've ever seen a conversation, been part of a conversation between someone who is more of a warrior and someone who's more of a builder, the connection breaks down. You have someone who's like, I want to tear down the system, and then you have someone who's like, here's a very technocratic thing that we could do to address one small thing in the system. It's like, okay, both of these are important, but there's a translation problem here, right? And so weavers can translate and harmonize those objectives and advance that work to create productive change. So when they're working together, there's a beautiful thing there. And part of the question is, how do they work together? And that's my next slide here. I want to talk about something called inside hand, outside hand. And this is sort of a little suggestion for how these players work together and something that we try to use locally. So inside hand, outside hand is essentially a practical approach to using the warrior builder weaver framework. So inside hand refers to internal, private, strategic planning that happens between warriors, builders, and weavers. So this is non-public. This is something that happens behind closed doors, in text message threads, in private meetings, for identifying what are our shared objectives and how do we advance our objectives together publicly. Okay, so this is non-public strategic planning. And so part of that could be, hey, you warriors, you're gonna hold your pitchforks and yell at the gates, and we, the weavers, are going to work quietly with our builder friends to say, hey, we don't want those warriors to tear down the city, right? So we need to figure out how to work together, how to create change. Okay, so that's a private agreement that happens behind the scenes. And this may seem a little messy or conniving, but that's how politics works. And that's how change happens in a lot of cases. And then outside hand refers to that external public coordinated action that actually implements those inside hand agreements. So you have public action that takes place, and sometimes it may look like two groups are at each other's throats a little bit, but they're actually working behind the scenes, and looking publicly like they're at each other's throats helps them advance some other objective. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that this inside hand, outside hand approach lets us advance. In Columbus, a lot of the groups that work with the city, we talk behind the scenes, right? And so if there's something that comes up, there's folks who are walking along the streets of Columbus, who are biking along the streets of Columbus, who get killed regularly, and and they're getting killed by drivers, they're getting killed by cars, and they're getting killed because of poor road design and mistakes that have been made for many, many years. And we talk behind the scenes, all of these groups, and we try to say, like, okay, if you're going to go to city council, if you're going to talk to city council, then we want to be there as well. We want to coordinate our public messaging that's going out. We want to make sure that we're calling on the city to do X or Y. But we also, and this is pretty clear, or this is pretty key, we also don't really want to piss the city of Columbus off, because then they may stop talking to us. So we have to thread that needle where we are pushing, but we are not alienating ourselves from being at the table when key conversations are happening. And so that is a inside hand, outside hand dynamic that we have to take into approach. Because Brian Estabrook, board president of Yay Bikes, I can't create change in the city of Columbus's policies and programs and infrastructure. But if I'm not even at the table at all, then that is creating a lack of effective advocacy for all the folks that Yay Bikes represents. So last slide, and then I'll throw it back to John, and we can open up for questions if there's time. This is sort of just the overview again, and I have some questions here for you all to think about moving forward. You know, if you see this as an effective approach, warriors, builders, weavers, and that inside hand, outside hand piece, you know, part of the question is, where do you see All Aboard Ohio sitting in this framework? Where do you see yourself fitting in this framework? How can All Aboard Ohio effectively fulfill these roles? Are there capabilities or capacities that All Aboard Ohio wants to grow, wants to develop, that maybe are not in place right now? And what other partners need to be at the table in order to play all of these roles effectively? Maybe we know a lot of builders inside the system, right? And we feel like we're playing a weaver role, but we're just not connected to a lot of warriors, right? And so we need to build out that network of partners so that we can effectively coordinate to create change. So I'll stop there and throw it back to our facilitators, and I'm happy to answer questions. And all of this is, as far as I'm concerned, you know, publicly available, and folks can use it and refer back to it. So thanks so much.
Wow. So thank you, Brian. I feel like we've got so much work to do, and Mitch, you'll get this. Boy, I wish we would have had this presentation before we did our strategic planning, because I've got so many ideas right now. But does anybody have any questions for Brian? I know that was an incredible presentation. And really, I feel so motivated right now and have so many ideas about how we can continue to move forward, both All Aboard Ohio individually, but then, you know, collectively with all the other orgs across the state. Glenn, I see your hand.
Yeah, Brian. The one caption that caught my eye was mobility justice. So how are you guys doing when it comes to disabled people that want to ride bikes, like your paraplegics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that we don't do anything specifically with paraplegic folks, but there are organizations locally that provide subsidized funding for bikes that allow for folks with different kinds of disabilities to ride bikes. You know, you have your hand bikes and you have your other sorts of mobility devices that allow people to ride. And I would say we have folks in our broader community that use those. One of the things that we think about with a group like folks who are living as paraplegics is we think about advocating around protected bike infrastructure away from cars, because those bikes sit so low to the ground in many cases that because of the size of vehicles, you can't see them in many cases. And it creates a greater threat to their life moving forward. And so we need to think about how to provide separation and protection for people operating different kinds of bikes, especially those bikes that sit low to the ground. Some people, like myself, are comfortable riding in traffic, have a little bit of a higher risk tolerance. Although I have a broken wrist right now. I just had wrist surgery because I was hit by a bike in Columbus, on the streets of Columbus, and I broke my wrist. So even people like me are at risk. But for people who want to ride their bike but don't want to be in traffic, or who it's much more dangerous for them to be in traffic because they're low to the ground because of using a certain style of bike, we need to create an interconnected network that allows them to move through the city, but not in traffic. And I think that's one of the key elements that is going to serve folks who are living with different kinds of disabilities, who use mobility devices, who use alternative kind of bikes. So that's what I would say to that. It's a great question, Glenn.
Yeah,
Thank
and I just wanted to add on, Glenn, like anywhere I've seen, one of the reasons I tend to refer to them as mobility lanes rather than bike lanes, when you have a protected mobility lane, it's not just for bicycles. I mean, you could use the scooters, but also you can use wheelchairs in those lanes. You can use other means of transportation. So really, in a lot of ways, there is an equity about it because there's a lot of people that can't drive, right? And sometimes we lose track of that. So a protected mobility lane enables a lot of people that aren't able to drive to use that. It's not just for bikes. Let's see. So I think Kevin's hand was up next. You want to go ahead with your question, Kevin?
Yeah, thank you. Brian, just wanted to thank you for your presentation today. Found it very insightful, and I hope your wrist gets better soon. Just a quick question for you. I'm up in Northeast Ohio, so not all that familiar with the political scene down in Columbus as a city. But when the city of Columbus is, or the county in this case, is trying to put forward changes, do you often see the state getting involved just because, it serves as the state's capital, or are they kind of hands off and just involved with it as they would be, through transportation planning for the state as a whole?
That's a good question. I'm not, there might be conversations that happen in their own inside hand way, at a higher level at the city and state, that I'm not privy to. My sense is that the state is not very involved, except for when, sort of state roads are involved, right? So I'm sure, I imagine you all might be familiar, but some roads have a state highway designation, and some of those roads go right through our cities, and that means that the state DOT, state Department of Transportation, basically has the final say or veto over what happens on those roads. And if the city wants to make them, slower, or put in traffic calming, or put in some kind of, I love the mobility lane reference. Thanks for giving me that. That was great. Put in mobility lanes. The city can't make a final decision on that. It goes to the state Department of Transportation to say, are we okay with this state road being changed? And they have different demands, and they have a whole different framework for how to think about that. And it's really for them the traditional sort of traffic engineering approach of throughput, right? We need to get a certain number of cars through in a certain amount of time, and sort of everything else be damned, if you will. And so I think that we do run into problems with roads that are designated as state highways. And there are some major roads in Columbus, like Broad Street, right? The old National Road, Route 40, that is still a state road. And that's actually where I got hit right here. So was on West Broad. So that is a big problem. And I think we need to rethink from a statewide perspective how much control the state DOT has on those local roads when it comes to local control and safety. So that's what I would say about that.
Thank you, Brian.
Lenny, our wonderful comms. I think you're the next one.
Yeah. Hey, Brian. I loved this whole presentation. It was super insightful. I'm going to be try working with you guys a little bit on the LinkUS collaboration, and that's actually a part of my question. How do you see this framework applying to All Aboard Ohio, Transit Columbus, and Yay Bikes kind of collaborating on the LinkUS project?
That's a great question, and I think that's something that is going to develop and it's going to emerge. I can't necessarily project exactly what it's going to look like, but here's what I'll say. And this, I speak on this as someone who works in local government. I work for Franklin County here in the county, and I work as a city planner. So what I would say from my vantage point as someone who works as a builder inside of the broader system is that anytime you have a plan like LinkUS, I would say the planning process itself, which is what we're getting toward the end of here, right? We're going to be moving into implementation of the plan once a funding source has been identified, which is on the ballot. When you're in the planning phase, it's very important, obviously, to make sure the plan says the right things and does the right things and aims in the right directions. But I think personally that the implementation phase is even more important for advocacy, because there's words on a page in a plan, right? But those can get interpreted and implemented in so many different ways. So essentially groups like All Aboard Ohio, Transit Columbus, and Yay Bikes are going to have to work together to sort of be a watchdog, if you will, on how that plan actually gets implemented and what priorities are chosen throughout the process. And so I think, we have to be familiar inside and outside with the plan itself, such that we can push and be an effective sort of oversight, if you will, on all of the entities who are implementing that plan. So, a lot of folks think like, hey, the plan's developed, our job is done. My thought is, plan's done, our job has just begun, because now there's going to be a decade plus of implementing that plan. And if somebody isn't watching closely and advocating, then it could be implemented very poorly. So that's what I would say about that. It's a great question. Thanks, Lenny.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Well, we are pretty much right at the 1 hour mark, friends. I would like to thank both of our guests, Councilmember Jeffries and Brian Estabrook from Yay Bikes, for being here today and giving us two really incredible presentations that I think we can all agree, although aren't passenger rail, I think I learned quite a bit from both. So thank you for that. I would like to invite everybody to our next statewide Zoom meeting. I did drop a note in the chat there, and then Brian was nice enough to add the link. It will be, of course, the second Saturday in October the 12th. And we're going to talk very directly about how we advocate with our elected officials. We've got a number of things coming up in the next year that we're going to be asking our members to advocate for. And we're very mindful of the fact that for us to just say, hey, send a letter to your representative or your senator or your congressman or woman, that may not be something that's just easily done. So we're going to have a couple of guests that are inside the political space, that kind of know how the sausage is made and are going to give us some tips about number one, how to write an effective letter or make an effective phone call, and number two, how to make sure that you get past maybe that first line of defense, as it were, and really get your message to the people that need to hear it. So I would really enjoy having everybody here with you. Glenn, I will give a quick plug here. NOPRA's luncheon is at the end of the month, Monday, September 30th, in the Martin Luther King Jr. Amtrak Station, Toledo, Ohio. He did put some details in there. Be sure to look at that if you're in the Northwest Ohio region. I will be up there on the panel. Thanks for the invite, Glenn. Other than that, appreciate you folks carving out an hour of your day on a Saturday morning. Get out there. It's a beautiful day, and we will see you again next month.